In the Gospel of Mark, we don't get a lot of dates or a timeline. But Mark 9:2 starts with a curious amount of specificity. 6 days later. Oddly precise. Mostly, the shortest of the Gospels is in a hurry to get there, wherever there is. Usually it's Jerusalem, but I always sense there's something from the very beginning trying to get to the empty tomb, get to the mystery, get to what's next. But here it seems like Mark wants to create a little bit of space between Jesus foretelling about his death at the end of Mark 8 and the hiking excursion with Peter, James, and John at the beginning of 9. The story, the Transfiguration of Jesus, occurs, as Glenn has shared, in all 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew's very similar to Mark, just adding the detail, Jesus' face shone. Not just the clothes, but the face. There was a physical change as well. And that they were all terrified, dropping the shade that Mark threw at Peter. Mark, we read that Peter spoke because he didn't know what to say. Matthew graciously omits that detail. Luke's account is a little bit longer. Again, there are a few additional details. Luke has Peter and the companions fall asleep, as Glenna mentioned, before Moses and Elijah show up. Like Mark, Luke also mentions that Peter didn't know what he was saying, though it's a bit more diplomatic. In all 3 Gospels, Jesus has a conversation with Moses and Elijah. None of them say what it was about. And that's pretty much this week, that's all I wanted to know. This week, all I could think about was, what were they talking about? Was it a catch-up conversation? Like, hey, you've been down on earth for a while, let me tell you about the bowling league. Or was it something like, we see what you're going through? Or was it even maybe more prescient, like what Jesus had just talked about in Mark 8? Hey, it's going to get hard. And you know what? We're pulling for you, Jesus. We don't know. And that just was eating at me this week because I wanted to know. The basic facts are consistent in all 3 synoptic Gospels. Jesus asks Peter, James, and John if they want to go on this day hike with them, presumably. He leads them up a high mountain. And at some point, he changes. His clothes are this dazzling white, whiter than could ever be bleached on earth. And according to Matthew, his face was also shining. This is the point at which Elijah and Moses show up. And the whole scene is mystical and otherworldly. And Peter blurted something out because he didn't know what else to do. As an aside, it's probably good that John did not include the Transfiguration. John already has a habit of kind of throwing shade at Peter. Recall that, for example, in John chapter 20, verse 4, the 2 disciples run to what would become they would discover as the empty tomb, but it was important to John to note that the other disciple outran Peter. So that for all of posterity, we know that at least one of the disciples, specifically the beloved disciple, was faster than Peter. If John had included the Transfiguration, well, I let my imagination go a little bit this week to think about how John would have portrayed it. I'll tell you about that later if you're so curious. But I like Mark's depiction of Peter because we would have done the same thing. Think about it. Each one of us. If we saw this divine interaction, heaven and earth touch, and Jesus standing with Moses and Elijah, and we knew who they were, well, we may have been too stupefied to say anything. So we may have been more like James and John with our mouths agape, or we may have had the confidence, the courage to say something like Peter. The only thing I wish the gospel writers had included, which they didn't, is also having Peter say to Jesus, Elijah, and Moses, "What are you all talking about?" If they had, I would know Peter and I were kindred spirits. But Elijah and Moses appeared from this long bygone era They had been gone for centuries at this point. They were superstars of the Hebrew tradition, and there they stood alongside the disciples' teacher, just having a conversation. At this point in the Bible story, Christianity hadn't been invented yet. Peter, James, and John were good Jewish boys following their rabbi on a hike. By Mark 9, Jesus had dropped enough clues that they might have had some growing suspicion that he was unique. Mark maintained this idea, as again Glenna mentioned, of the messianic secret. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone what you just saw. Don't tell anyone what you think is going to happen until Easter. And I'll explain what Easter is later too. But don't say anything yet. And we get that theme through Mark because there's a hurry to get there, but there's a timeline. Let's wait and see how this plays out. Even if James and John were clued in to what was happening, they were still, in that time, trying to figure it out. Elijah and Moses showing up absolutely would have rocked their world. Even their appearance in Mark is out of order. In the Gospel of Mark, Elijah is tagged first, yet Moses came before him in the Old Testament. Maybe people complained because when Matthew and Luke wrote this account later, they switched the order. But I like Mark's order. I like naming Elijah first, just like Peter giving us someone with whom we can identify. Putting Elijah first breaks the timeline. We think things should go in a certain order. I certainly do. That this goes first, then comes that. First we read about Moses, then we read about Elijah. But having two historical figures show up out of order provides this micro reminder that God is beyond time. God is beyond our rules. God isn't bound by our expectations. When we say we think we can or we think this is possible, God's there to remind us, are you forgetting something? With God, all things are possible. Back in 1 Kings, God's Spirit whisked Elijah from place to place at the beginning of chapter 18. At the end of 1 Kings 18, we see God giving Elijah this incredible speed to outrun the royal chariots. And in 2 Kings chapter 2, Elijah ascends to heaven on a chariot of fire. At that point in Mark's story, some people were saying that Jesus was Elijah reborn. For Peter, James, and John to see the two of them talking would give them a reason to later refute these claims. And the voice from heaven, a few verses later, provided another big clue about what was coming for Jesus. Moses' appearance doesn't bring the story back down to earth either at all. I mean, setting aside that he had been gone for centuries at that point, if we think back to Moses' departure in Deuteronomy, he died on Mount Nebo in Moab. He was overlooking the promised land but hadn't reached it. He could see it but didn't get there. And according to Deuteronomy 34, 5, and 6, Moses died at God's command, and the Lord buried him in a valley in Moabite country. And in the passage in Deuteronomy concludes, even now, no one knows where Moses' grave is. These two, Elijah and Moses, provide the perfect conversation partners for the transfigured Jesus. The connection between heaven and earth has been shattered. And there at the top of that high, unnamed mountain, Peter, James, and John witnessed heaven and earth touch. I've been to what I consider thin spaces. Those special places that feel like the barrier between heaven and earth gets to be really narrow. Where it feels like there's something special. Maybe you've experienced one too. In those spaces we feel God's presence. And this can happen in many places. Lourdes in France, or in the Iona community or Iona Island in Scotland. There are places in Iceland. There are Druid forests in England. There are places where it feels unique. It can also be in cathedrals or even spaces like this. Another common sighting of those thin spaces is by natural wonders. When my family went to Niagara Falls a few months ago, the power and majesty of 680,000 gallons of water flowing every second was otherworldly. And we situate these experiences by reminding ourselves where we are. We can grab reality and find footing. Like a drowning sailor grasping for a life preserver, we reach out for reminders of our world. We look for what is familiar. Next to the roaring waterfall, we can grab the railing, look down at the sidewalk, and remind ourselves that that unimaginable volume of water, the power and the roar and all of that that's happening right next to us, this is natural, this is normal, it's okay. What happened on the Mount of Transfiguration gives no quarter for what is normal. And instead of having something familiar to use as a firm footing or a place to grasp, Mark wants us to struggle. Mark wants the readers to wrestle with what happened. Mark wants us to try to do all we can to make sense, yet still come up empty, going, it's beyond our capacity to ask or imagine. We live in a world full of explanations, and I'm in a room of very, very bright people. And I presume the people who are watching are very smart too. You all have so much collective knowledge, and we can explain so many things. Scientists can tell us all of the details about natural wonders. I didn't just make up 680,000 gallons of water per second. That's how much they calculate goes over Horseshoe Falls in Niagara. Psychologists can even attempt to explain the feelings we have in what are often called sacred or thin spaces. We know so much, and our rational minds want to explain so much. But the transfiguration of Jesus remains a mystery. It points to something otherworldly. It points to something beyond us. Our epistle lesson about the gospel being veiled is part of this mystery. If God had asked us how to tell the divine story, we might do it differently. We wouldn't do it better, but we might do it differently. Our version would probably be clumsy and obvious, and every generation would have to rewrite it, because we would either forget something or we would realize that people would later take what we had said and interpret it in a way we had never intended. But here we have Jesus. Here we have Jesus, the divine teacher of all who seek truth, beauty, and goodness. And he took us on a hike. And at that mountaintop, he pulled back the veil just a little bit. And that veil is lifted. We can witness this heavenly conversation. We don't get the content. That would be too much for us. But we get to see it happen. Because when we truly see it, when we open our eyes, when we open the eyes of our hearts, that glimpse is enough. It's enough to plant that tiniest seed of faith. And when it grows, as Jesus said elsewhere, it grows beyond all of the shrubs. It grows to be the greatest. Today, rest in faith. Rest in wonder. Embrace mystery. Embrace that empty tomb as we prepare for our Lenten journey. God is moving. God is moving here. God is moving in our midst. And God is moving in your life. God is bigger than anything we can ever imagine. Amen.